I never expected to see the richest man I had ever worked for collapse in front of me. Yet that afternoon, as the lights of the grand hall shimmered above hundreds of watching eyes, and the air vibrated with the tension that always followed him wherever he went, something inside him broke with a sharpness so sudden and so shocking that for a moment I genuinely wondered if I had imagined the entire scene, because nothing in all the years I had served as his closest assistant had prepared me for the sight of a man built from iron and ambition, crumbling like fragile glass, right in the center of a room designed to celebrate his power. The event was meant to be a demonstration of everything he had conquered, an extravagant display of wealth, reputation, and control, a gathering filled with people who whispered his name with either fear or admiration, depending on how close they stood to the empire he commanded. And I remember standing just a few steps behind him, rehearsing the order of speeches in my mind and preparing myself to anticipate his needs before he even voiced them, because that was what working for a man like him demanded. Constant vigilance, unbroken precision, and a quiet understanding that his world was held together by the illusion that nothing could ever touch him. I had seen him face hostile negotiations without blinking, had watched him dismiss threats with a smirk, had observed him walk through storms of scandal with the kind of calm that infuriated his enemies and intimidated his allies. And I believed, with a conviction deeper than logic, that he was a man incapable of emotional collapse, someone who had trained himself to stand above the vulnerabilities that dragged ordinary people down. But in that moment, all of those assumptions disintegrated as he froze mid-sentence during his speech, his voice halting as though something unseen had seized him by the throat and pulled him violently backward into a memory only he could see. At first, the audience thought it was a dramatic pause, a deliberate strategy to build suspense, because he often used silence the way other men used weapons. But when his hand trembled around the microphone and his chest rose in a sharp, panicked breath, the room shifted from admiration to confusion, then to a heavy, collective dread that spread like a cold wind across polished floors and crystal chandeliers, as if the walls themselves sensed the collapse of the man they had been built to honor. I felt my own breath catch as I stepped forward, unsure if he needed support or space, because even though I had memorized his patterns and reactions over the years, this was something entirely unfamiliar, as if the version of him I knew had disappeared and left behind a stranger wearing the same expensive suit, but carrying 1,000 times more pain than I had ever imagined hiding beneath his immaculate exterior. People stopped moving, their conversations dying mid-word, their glasses suspended in the air, their faces contorting into bewilderment and fascination, because the spectacle of power faltering in public is something human beings are drawn to in the same way they are drawn to tragedy. They watch, stunned, unable to look away, desperate to understand what force could bring an untouchable man to his knees. And then, cutting through the silence with an ease that felt impossible, came the soft, hesitant footsteps of a child. A small figure at the back of the hall, his clothes worn thin, his hair unwashed, his body so out of place among the glittering suits and designer gowns that I initially believed security would remove him before anyone even registered his presence. Yet no one moved, perhaps because something in the way he walked carried a strange, quiet purpose, as if he had not stumbled into the room by accident, but had been pulled here by a thread neither he nor the billionaire could escape. I remember staring at the child, shocked not only by the fact that he had managed to cross into a world where people like him were rarely acknowledged, but by the expression on his face, a mixture of sorrow, certainty, and an innocence bruised by hardships he was far too young to understand. And for a moment I felt a chill slide down my spine, as if the room itself recognized him in a way the billionaire had not yet begun to grasp. The boy stopped just a few feet from the stage, his gaze steady, almost unbearably calm, and as the billionaire's trembling eyes finally met the child's, something in his posture collapsed completely. Not physically, but emotionally, as though the strength he had spent a lifetime constructing had been snatched away by an invisible hand the moment this fragile stranger entered his line of vision. I couldn't breathe as the boy slowly lifted his chin and whispered 5 soft words. Words so quiet that only those of us nearest to him heard them clearly. Words that seemed too small to cause the devastation they unleashed. Words that sliced through whatever defenses the billionaire had left and opened a wound inside him so deep that I saw tears spill down his face before he had any chance of stopping them. And as that whisper echoed inside the stillness of the hall, something inside him cracked open like a wound he never healed. He always looked untouchable, a man built from steel and ego, someone whose presence alone could silence a room before a single word left his lips. Yet I knew, far better than anyone who only saw him through newspaper headlines, business magazines, and success stories carved out of intimidation, that beneath the immaculate suits and the perfectly calculated movements lived fractures he worked tirelessly to hide, cracks that only showed themselves in the rare moments when he let the mask slip, which happened almost never, but often enough for me to understand that the man the world admired and the man I served were not the same. I first met him during a time when I believed ambition could devour entire lives without remorse. And maybe that's why he hired me, because he recognized in me a smaller version of the relentless hunger he carried. A hunger he used as both shield and weapon as he built an empire so vast and so meticulously controlled that even his competitors whispered his name like a warning. Yet the longer I worked beside him, the more I realized his empire wasn't built with brilliance alone, but with a kind of emotional detachment so sharp, it seemed to cut through every relationship he encountered, leaving him surrounded by people who respected him professionally, but feared him personally. He didn't rise to the top through kindness. He climbed through precision, discipline, and a calculated disregard for anyone who couldn't keep up with the pace he demanded. And I witnessed countless executives crumble beneath the weight of his expectations, their voices trembling as they delivered presentations that never seemed good enough, their confidence dissolving as he pointed out flaws with a single raised eyebrow. The kind of subtle dismissal that hurt more than any shouted insult ever could, because he didn't need volume to assert dominance. He ruled with silence, with presence, with the cold certainty that he would never lower himself to feel anything as fragile as empathy. Working for him required adaptation. I learned that quickly. He expected punctuality down to the second, precision down to the letter, and loyalty that didn't ask questions, because in his world, emotional distance was currency, and anyone who allowed feelings to interfere with performance was considered weak and therefore replaceable, and I cannot pretend I didn't internalize some of those beliefs myself, especially in the early years when his approval felt like sunlight and his disapproval felt like winter, and I molded myself into someone who anticipated his needs before he voiced them, someone who read his expression from across a room, someone who could translate the smallest shift in his tone into an actionable command. But even as I perfected the art of navigating his moods, I couldn't ignore the truth that lingered in the corners of his life. The truth that he kept no close friends, trusted no one, and treated vulnerability as an unforgivable sin, not only in others but especially in himself. And over time, I began to recognize the exhaustion beneath his authority, the way his shoulders tightened after meetings, the way his jaw clenched in moments of silence, the way he sometimes stared out the window of his penthouse office at the city he controlled as though he were searching for something he lost long ago and feared he would never recover. I saw his coldness not as natural, but as manufactured, layered piece by piece over years of discipline and denial, and every time someone called him heartless or ruthless, I wondered how much of that identity was intentional and how much had been forced upon him by a past he refused to acknowledge, a past that shaped him into a man who believed survival meant building walls so high that even he could no longer see the world beyond them. He wasn't incapable of feeling. He was terrified of feeling, and the deeper I sank into the orbit of his life, the more I understood the quiet desperation behind his strict rules, his sharp directives, his cutting expectations, and although the world saw a man in complete control, I saw the truth. He lived in a state of constant battle against emotions he refused to let surface, emotions that pressed against the edges of his carefully constructed armor, threatening to expose the humanity he had spent decades burying. Still, nothing. Not the long nights, not the haunting silences, not the rare flashes of pain in his eyes, prepared me for the moment his world collided with a reality he couldn't dominate or silence, because for all his power, influence, and wealth, for all the ways he commanded boardrooms and bent markets to his will, there was one thing he had never learned to fight against, one presence he could not intimidate, and one truth he could not outrun. Yet nothing in his powerful world prepared him for the fragile boy waiting outside the elevator. The boy's clothes were torn, his eyes exhausted, yet he looked at the billionaire with a calmness that frightened me in a way I couldn't immediately explain, because nothing about his appearance or his presence matched the world we were standing in. A world built on marble floors, glass walls, and ceilings so high they made every ordinary person feel smaller the moment they entered. A world where men wore tailored suits that cost more than the average worker earned in a month, and where women floated through the lobby in polished heels and perfect confidence. And yet this child, this fragile, dirt-smudged, painfully thin boy, stood in the center of it all, as if he belonged there more than any of us. I first noticed him near the revolving doors, small and still, watching everything with eyes that were far too old for his face. And for a moment I thought he was lost, the kind of child who might have wandered away from a distracted parent. But as I moved closer, I realized the truth was far more complicated, because no parent with the means to walk into that building would dress their child the way he was dressed, or allow him to stand alone in the cold lobby with nothing but a threadbare shirt and shoes worn down to the point where the soles looked dangerously thin. At first I assumed security would intervene, because they always did when someone who didn't fit the building's polished aesthetic stepped inside, and I watched the guards approach him with the usual blend of suspicion and rehearsed politeness, ready to escort him out before anyone of importance noticed. Yet he didn't flinch, didn't step back, didn't lower his gaze the way most people did when confronted by authority in this place. Instead, he simply stood there, small, steady, strangely composed, as if he wasn't intimidated by the expensive architecture towering above him, or the men twice his size looming only inches away, and that stillness, that unshakable calm, unsettled me more than anything else. When the guards asked him where his parents were, he answered softly that he had none. When they asked why he had come inside, he told them he wasn't lost. And when they asked who he was looking for, he spoke the billionaire's full name with a certainty that made the air around us tighten, because I couldn't understand how a child like him, a child with no shoes fit for winter, no belongings except the small fabric pouch clutched in his hand, and no apparent connection to our world, could possibly know the name of a man whose life was shielded by layers of power, privacy, and protection. My initial reaction was disbelief mixed with concern, not only because he seemed far too vulnerable to be wandering into a world that would chew him up and spit him out without remorse, but because something in his eyes reminded me of a kind of desperation I had seen before. A desperation that came not from fear, but from purpose, as though he had come here not by accident, but by some invisible pull he could neither control nor resist. And I felt a pressure inside my chest that I couldn't explain, a sense that this moment was about to spiral into something far bigger than a simple misunderstanding between a child and building security. The contrast between the billionaire's world and the child's poverty cut through me like a blade. The lobby was filled with towering digital screens broadcasting stock updates, with business executives rushing past carrying leather briefcases, with a constant metallic chime from the elevators announcing the endless movement of people who believed their time was more valuable than anyone else's. And yet in the middle of all this noise and motion stood a boy whose life seemed built on silence, hardship, and survival. His presence forming a jarring fracture in the building's perfection, a living reminder that the world outside these walls wasn't made of luxury, but of struggle. Most people in this place never acknowledged. When the guards attempted to escort him out, he didn't fight, and he didn't plead, but he refused to walk toward the door, planting his feet firmly on the polished floor, repeating with soft but unwavering certainty that he would not leave until he spoke to the billionaire. And there was something in the way he said it, something steady, almost haunting, that stopped the guards long enough for confusion to ripple between them, because children did not speak that way in this building, and people without power did not insist on talking to a man who controlled more wealth than entire towns. I walked toward him slowly, unsure whether my instinct was to protect him or protect the billionaire from whatever emotional storm this fragile stranger seemed poised to unleash. And as I approached, his eyes lifted toward mine with a depth that made my breath hitch. Because in that single look I sensed a story far heavier than the small body carrying it, a truth that trembled beneath the surface, like something waiting to be revealed at the worst possible moment. The billionaire had just finished a meeting upstairs, the elevator doors sliding open with their usual metallic whisper, and the moment the boy heard that sound, he turned toward it with a kind of focus that shook me to my core, because it felt as though he had been waiting for that exact moment, that exact sound, that exact arrival. And my heart pounded as the billionaire stepped out onto the marble floor, unaware that a force he couldn't control was about to collide with him in the most devastating way possible. And when the child finally stepped forward, I felt the air change around us. I expected the boy to ask for money, but instead, his quiet voice turned the billionaire's face ghost white, draining the color from his expression so quickly that I instinctively stepped toward him, certain that something far more dangerous than a simple request had just taken place in front of all of us. Because the moment the child opened his mouth, the world inside that vast lobby shifted, as though the air itself understood the magnitude of what was coming before any of us did. The boy didn't raise his voice, didn't shout, didn't tremble the way a child usually does when standing in the shadow of a man whose presence had the ability to silence grown executives. Instead, he looked directly at the billionaire with an expression that held no anger and no fear, only a steady, heartbreaking resolve. And then he whispered 5 simple words. Words so soft I almost thought I misheard them until I saw the billionaire's entire body recoil, as if those small syllables had struck him with the force of a physical blow. The exact moment the boy spoke, time seemed to fracture. Conversations froze in mid-air, the elevator doors behind us paused as if reluctant to continue closing, and even the hum of the security radios seemed to fade into a hollow quiet, as though every sound in the building recognized that something irreversible had just happened. Something that sliced straight through the billionaire's carefully built exterior and exposed a wound no one knew existed. His instant collapse wasn't dramatic or loud, but it was unmistakable. His chest tightened with a sharp, audible breath. His hand flew to the edge of the counter as though he needed something to anchor him, and his eyes, usually so sharp and unshakable, widened in a way I had never seen before, as if the boy had just ripped open a door he had spent decades bolting shut, and now the very memories he feared most were flooding back with brutal force. People around us didn't know how to react. Some stared with embarrassment, some with fascination, and others with a kind of discomfort, usually reserved for moments that feel too intimate, too raw, too personal to witness. Yet no one looked away, because the sight of a man like him, someone untouchable, someone immovable, being emotionally undone by the voice of a child, was something no one could have imagined even in their wildest narratives about power and downfall. The silence in the room was suffocating, stretching wider with every tremor that passed through the billionaire's body, and I felt my skin prickle with a strange mix of confusion and fear, because I knew this wasn't weakness, nor humiliation, nor any of the emotions he despised in others. This was something deeper, something older, something that had lived inside him long before he built his empire, something he had fought to bury so thoroughly that even I, despite working by his side for years, had only ever seen flickers of it hiding behind his eyes when he believed no one was watching. I kept replaying the boy's 5 words in my mind, silently mouthing them to myself, trying to understand why they held so much weight, why they could break a man who had survived betrayal, loss, and public scrutiny without shedding a single tear. And the more I studied his shaking hands and unfocused gaze, the more a cold realization began creeping into me, settling beneath my ribs like ice. Because I had heard those words before. Not from a child, not in a lobby, not in this moment, but in a memory he once tried to silence, a memory I wasn't supposed to witness, a memory he believed no one remembered except him. The boy's 5 words matched something I once overheard in the billionaire's darkest memory. I watched him fall apart in a way no power, no money, and no control could stop, and the fear that surged through me in that moment felt unlike anything I had ever experienced in all the years I had worked beside him, because this was not the breakdown of a man under stress or pressure or fatigue, but the unraveling of someone who had spent a lifetime building himself into a monument of emotional invincibility, a man who believed vulnerability was a flaw that destroyed empires, a man who refused to show weakness even in private. And yet here he was, trembling in front of strangers, his breath fractured and uneven, as though the air itself had turned against him and refused to move through his lungs. His body shook with a violence so unexpected that several executives instinctively stepped back, not out of disgust, but out of shock, because watching someone so powerful lose control of something as basic as breathing felt almost unreal, like witnessing a machine malfunction rather than seeing a human being crumble. And as his shoulders heaved in desperate, uneven motions, his hand clutched at the edge of the counter with such force that his knuckles turned white, his fingers bending as if he were holding on to the last physical anchor he could find in a world that had suddenly collapsed beneath him. His voice, usually steady and commanding, cracked with a rawness that sent a chill racing down my spine, because the man who could silence a boardroom with a single word now couldn't form more than a broken sound that barely pushed past his trembling lips, and every attempt he made to speak dissolved into a strained rasp, a struggle between the memories rising inside him and the instinctive terror of having them exposed in front of people he didn't trust. His hands shook uncontrollably, not with the slight tremor of age or stress, but with the violent quiver of someone who had been dragged back into a moment he had spent years trying to forget. And as the tremors deepened, I could see his entire body resisting something invisible, as if he were fighting off a memory wrapped around his throat, pulling him backward through time with a force he couldn't outrun. The staff didn't know how to handle the situation. They exchanged panicked glances, unsure whether they should call medical assistance, security, or simply pretend they saw nothing. Because every person in that lobby had been trained to treat him like a force of nature rather than a human being. And now that he was experiencing a very human collapse, they seemed paralyzed by the unfamiliarity of it, unable to bridge the gap between the titan they knew and the wounded man trembling in front of them. I stepped closer, driven not by duty but by something deeper, an instinct that came from knowing him more intimately than anyone else in this building. An instinct that told me he didn't need a doctor or a guard or a subordinate right now. He needed someone who understood the language he never allowed himself to speak, the language of fear, grief, and memory. And as I reached for his arm, I felt the heat of his panic radiating through his suit jacket. The tension in his muscles coiled so tightly it felt like touching a man bracing for impact. I whispered his name, hoping the sound of a familiar voice might ground him, but instead he flinched, as though my touch had collided with a place he had forced himself not to feel. And then, just as I was about to speak again, his lips parted and he whispered a name. Not his own, not mine, not anyone from the room, but a name drenched in so much emotion, so much longing and fear and grief, that my entire body stiffened in recognition before I even processed the syllables correctly. He didn't shout it. He breathed it out in a trembling murmur, each letter trembling as though dragged across the jagged edges of a broken memory. And hearing that name, sent a shiver through me so violently that I felt rooted to the floor, because I had heard him speak it only once before, late one night when he believed he was alone, when the lights in his office were low and his guard had slipped just long enough for a ghost from his past to escape the prison he had built around it. As the name slipped from his mouth again, heavy with meanings no one else in the lobby could understand, I felt something inside me tighten with an uneasy certainty, because I knew what that name represented, knew the story attached to it, knew the pain he had buried so deep that speaking it aloud felt like tearing open a wound he had sworn would never bleed again. And I realized, with a clarity that made my heart pound against my ribs, that this moment wasn't just a breakdown. It was the emergence of a truth he had spent a lifetime running from, the truth tied to that whispered name, the truth he never allowed anyone to question, the truth that had just been ripped to the surface by a boy who should never have known it. That name unlocked a past he never allowed anyone to question. For years, he hid the story of the one person who once made him human and broke him completely, and I realized this with a clarity that cut straight through me the moment he whispered that name, because it was a name tied not to a colleague, not to a business partner, not to someone who had shaped his empire, but to someone who had shaped him, someone whose existence explained the pieces of him that never quite fit the image he tried to project to the world, someone whose loss carved a hollow place inside him that no amount of wealth or power had ever been able to refill. My discovery of his childhood trauma had not come from anything he willingly shared, because he was a man who guarded his past the way others guard their fortunes, keeping every memory locked behind iron walls, refusing to let anyone glimpse the moments that shaped the shadows behind his eyes. Yet on one late night, one of those rare evenings when exhaustion loosened the grip of his control, I overheard just enough to understand that the unshakable giant I served had once been a boy who knew the raw taste of fear, abandonment, and heartbreak long before he knew the taste of success. He had spoken the story in fragments, his voice rough and barely audible as he thought he was alone. And I had remained frozen outside his office door, not daring to move as he murmured about a small, fragile sibling who used to cling to his hand during storms, a younger brother whose presence had softened him in a world that taught him hardness far too early, a child who trusted him completely because he was the only steady thing in a collapsing home. And when he whispered the 5 words, those same words the boy in the lobby had just spoken, I felt a chill sweep through me even then, because the broken tenderness in his voice made it clear that those words were not just a memory, but a wound that had never healed. The person who originally said those 5 words was that younger brother, a child who depended on him, who believed in him, who loved him, and who was taken from him before either of them had a chance to grow beyond the chaos of their childhood. And the guilt he carried from that loss seeped into every quiet moment of his adult life, shaping the man he became in ways I had never fully understood until now. His loss hollowed him out, turning him into someone who believed that attachment led only to suffering, that love made people fragile, that vulnerability was a luxury he could not afford. And so he built a life on the opposite of what he had once been, a life of control, distance, and emotional armor so thick he convinced himself it was strength, when in reality it was grief disguised as survival. The guilt he carried was the kind that reshapes a person permanently. He blamed himself for not protecting his brother, for not being strong enough, for not preventing the tragedy that stole the only person who ever saw him as more than a weapon against the world. And that guilt became the foundation of the ruthless personality he later constructed, training himself to feel nothing because feeling something had once destroyed him completely. Everything about him, the sharpness of his rules, the coldness of his tone, the emotional distance he demanded from everyone around him, was not born from arrogance but from fear. The fear that caring again would break him in the same way caring once had. And as I stood in that lobby watching him crumble in front of the child, I realized that this wasn't a random collapse. This was the past rising with a vengeance, dragging him back into a memory he had spent his entire life trying to outrun. But what shook me even more was the unmistakable truth forming in the back of my mind. The truth that made my breath slow and my pulse surge with a mix of dread and disbelief, because the resemblance between the child's voice and the fragments I heard years ago was not something I could ignore, and a part of me understood, long before he would allow the thought to form, that this connection ran deeper than shock, deeper than coincidence, deeper than anything we were prepared to face. But the connection between that memory and the child wasn't a coincidence. When I learned the boy's story, it felt like watching the billionaire's past replay in real time, as though someone had lifted the most painful chapters of his childhood and placed them directly into the small, shaking hands of this fragile boy who had walked into our world with nothing but determination and a grief far too heavy for someone his age to carry. And as I listened, piece by piece, to the truth he eventually allowed me to hear, I felt a chill settle inside my chest, because the echoes of their lives were so hauntingly similar that it became impossible to dismiss any part of what was unfolding as random coincidence or desperate imagination. The child's home situation was the kind of reality most people in this building would never understand, the kind of poverty that hides in back alleys and old buildings, the kind that shapes a child into an adult long before they have the chance to experience anything close to innocence. And he told me, with quiet pauses that revealed just how much pain he was trying to mask, that he lived in a place where the electricity worked only sometimes, where the windows never fully closed, where the nights were cold enough to make his bones ache, and where he had learned to sleep lightly because loud voices, slammed doors, and sudden footsteps could mean danger instead of safety. He described taking care of himself in ways no child should ever have to imagine, explaining how he rationed food, how he learned to make a single piece of bread last an entire day, how he memorized the creaks in the floors so he could avoid waking the people who might hurt him if they knew he was awake. And as he spoke, he kept his gaze fixed somewhere past my shoulder, as if the memories he was revealing were so painful that even looking at another human being while recounting them felt unbearable. His survival struggles were not heroic tales of grit and triumph, but quiet, excruciating battles fought every day, battles that required endurance far beyond his years. And as he told me how he sometimes slept outside because outside felt safer than the place he called home, how he skipped school because hunger made it impossible to focus, and how he learned to hide bruises beneath sleeves too big for his thin arms. I felt something inside me twist, not just out of sympathy, but out of the growing realization that I had heard similar stories, whispered by a different voice. A voice belonging to a boy who grew up to become the man now trembling in the center of the lobby. When I asked him why he had come looking for the billionaire, his answer was not immediate. He hesitated long enough that I wondered if he might change his mind, or worse, retreat into silence. But then he took a slow breath and confessed that he had not come because he wanted money or food or shelter, although he clearly needed all three, but because someone had once told him, someone he trusted more than anyone else, that if he was ever lost, if he was ever scared, if he ever felt alone in the world, he should find the man whose name he had spoken in that lobby, because that man had once made a promise the child didn't fully understand but believed in, because it was the last thing he had been taught before his world fell apart. His emotional wounds mirrored the billionaire's youth so precisely that I found myself unable to breathe as the parallels unfolded. A broken home, a lost caregiver, years of loneliness disguised as strength, the constant attempt to survive without becoming visible enough for someone to hurt him, and the aching desire to find the one person who might bring even a sliver of safety back into a life defined by instability. And as he spoke, I realized that the boy was not simply echoing the billionaire's childhood. He was living it, step for step, fear for fear, heartbreak for heartbreak, as if fate had rewritten the same tragedy with a new face. There was something almost unbearable about hearing such a young child describe emotions he should not even recognize yet, emotions like abandonment, guilt, and longing. And when he explained that the person who told him to seek out the billionaire was someone who could no longer protect him, someone who had vanished from his life without warning, leaving him with nothing but memories and those 5 haunting words, I felt the ground beneath my certainty shift, because everything he said seemed to tighten the thread connecting the past to this moment, as though both lives were being pulled toward a truth neither of them was ready to face. And when he finally revealed why he had spoken those exact 5 words, why he had whispered them with such fragile confidence, why he believed the billionaire was the only person who would understand them, why he felt compelled to walk into a building where he clearly didn't belong, I felt a cold tremor crawl up my spine, not because the words themselves were frightening, but because the story behind them carried the unmistakable signature of a past I thought the billionaire had buried forever, a past that was now rising to the surface through the voice of a child who shouldn't have known anything about it. And the reason he spoke those exact 5 words sent chills down my spine. I realized their meeting wasn't accidental. It was a collision of 2 broken histories, 2 lives shaped by abandonment, 2 souls carrying wounds carved in childhood, 2 stories that had been running parallel for years without either of them knowing, until fate, or something far more painful, forced them into the same moment, into the same breath, into the same shattering truth that neither of them was prepared to face. And as I stood between them, I felt the weight of a revelation so overwhelming that it seemed to warp the very air around us. The billionaire saw himself in the boy almost instantly, not in a sentimental or poetic way, but in the brutal recognition that comes when a person suddenly confronts the younger version of themselves, the version they tried to forget, the version they spent their entire adult life outperforming, outgrowing, and burying beneath layers of success, wealth, and ruthlessness, the version they hoped no one would ever see again. The moment the boy turned his face slightly, catching the light just enough for the billionaire to study the shadows under his eyes, and the sharpness of his fear-hardened features. Something inside the man cracked audibly, as if his heart had snapped under the sudden pressure of memory and regret colliding without warning. The emotional tension rising between them felt almost physical, thick enough to press against my chest and make it difficult to breathe, because neither of them moved, neither of them spoke. And yet the silence seemed louder than any scream, louder than any collapsing world, louder than the sound of the billionaire's breath hitching as his eyes traveled across the boy's bruised knuckles, his too thin arms, and the haunted heaviness that doesn't belong in a child's eyes unless life has stripped away every layer of innocence far too early. It was a painful recognition of shared trauma, a recognition that did not require explanation or logic or narrative, because the resemblance between their emotional wounds was carved in the way they stared at each other. Two survivors of different decades, but the same kind of suffering. Two people who had learned to walk through life with the constant expectation of losing the few they cared about. Two hearts that had built walls so thick they convinced themselves the walls were strength, not scars. The billionaire tried to speak, tried to reach for the boy with words that might bridge the chasm between past and present. But every attempt dissolved the moment his lips parted, because emotion overwhelmed him before sound could form, leaving him trembling and breathless, his voice collapsing under the weight of everything he had suppressed for years. I watched him open his mouth once, twice, 3 times, each attempt weaker than the last, until he finally pressed a shaking hand against his chest, as if trying to hold something inside. Something that threatened to spill out in a flood he wasn't ready to release. His silence was not cold or distant. It was agonized. The silence of a man who had spent his life believing that emotional control was power, only to discover in this moment that no amount of discipline could tame the storm rising inside him, not when the past had resurfaced in the form of a child who embodied everything he lost, everything he feared, everything he never forgave himself for. I stepped toward the boy carefully, my voice gentle as I asked whether he wanted to sit, whether he needed water, whether he was frightened, and he looked at me with an expression that held too much understanding for someone so young, the understanding of someone who had survived enough to know that adults often asked the wrong questions because they didn't know how to face the right ones. He didn't sit. He didn't reach for my hand. He simply lifted his gaze back to the billionaire, studying him with the same steady, sorrowful intensity he had shown from the beginning, as if standing in the presence of a man broken open by the past was not intimidating for him, but familiar. Painfully familiar. I could feel the billionaire's breathing unsteady behind me, sharp and uneven, as if each inhale was soaked in grief, and each exhale carried the weight of memories he had spent too many years trying to outrun, and I realized that this moment, this impossible collision of 2 wounded lives, was forcing him to confront the one truth he feared acknowledging, that he had not survived his childhood so much as he had built a life designed to keep it buried. And now, in the shape of this boy, it had clawed its way back to him. Slowly, the boy shifted his eyes toward me, and the change in his expression was so subtle yet so deliberate that I felt the hair at the back of my neck rise, because up until now, he had spoken only to the billionaire, only to the man whose past he echoed. But for the first time, he seemed to be preparing to share something he wasn't ready for the billionaire to hear, something private, something heavy enough to require a different kind of courage. I knelt slightly, lowering myself so my eyes were level with his, and asked in a low voice what he needed from me, what he wanted me to understand, and with a hesitancy so fragile it nearly broke me. The boy leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper, choosing his words with a precision that suggested he had carried this secret for far too long without knowing whom to trust with it. And then the boy told me something privately that changed everything. For the first time since I met him, he wasn't giving orders. He was begging for a chance to fix what was broken, and the sight of him standing there with his shoulders lowered, his voice trembling, and his pride stripped away felt so surreal that I almost didn't recognize him, because this wasn't the man who built an empire through discipline and domination. This was someone trying desperately to reclaim a piece of humanity he had abandoned long ago. Someone who finally understood the weight of the damage left behind by a past he had never confronted until it stared back at him through the eyes of a trembling child. He took responsibility with a sincerity that felt unfamiliar coming from him, not because he had never apologized before. He rarely did, but because this apology wasn't strategic, wasn't calculated, wasn't meant to protect his image or repair his reputation. It was raw, unfiltered remorse from a man who had spent years convincing himself that emotions were weaknesses and that vulnerability was the quickest path to destruction. And now, faced with the fragile boy who embodied everything he lost, he found himself forced to reckon with truths he had buried so deeply he no longer believed they could hurt him. He tried to help the boy materially at first, offering solutions the only way he knew how, with money, shelter, safety, promises of security that could alter the child's entire life in a single breath. And he spoke quickly, as though afraid that if he paused even for a moment, the chance to save this boy would slip away, as though material generosity could somehow erase the emotional chaos unraveling inside him. He promised a new home, new clothes, new opportunities, tutors, doctors, a future shaped by resources instead of suffering. And for a second, I thought he believed he could solve everything simply by throwing his fortune at the problem the way he had solved every other crisis in his life. But then something inside him shifted, and his voice softened with an unfamiliar ache, as if he understood, perhaps for the first time, that money alone couldn't heal wounds carved into a child's heart. And I watched in stunned silence as he knelt, an act I had never imagined witnessing from a man who demanded the world bend to him, until he was at eye level with the boy, his breath unsteady, as he tried to offer emotional comfort from a place inside him he had kept locked away for decades. He told the boy he wasn't alone anymore, told him he didn't have to fight his battles in the dark, told him there was someone willing to stand between him and the world, someone who understood the fear he carried because he had carried the same fear once, someone who wanted to give him more than stability. He wanted to give him compassion, understanding, and the chance to grow without feeling like survival was his only purpose. The emotional walls he had fortified his entire life began to break right in front of me, not in some dramatic, explosive way, but in subtle moments. The shake in his inhale, the tremor in his hand as he reached toward the child, the softness in his expression when he admitted how much he had failed the people he once cared about, the painful honesty in his voice when he told the boy he never wanted to fail another child again. It felt like watching a fortress collapse one stone at a time, each confession loosening a piece of the emotional armor he had worn for so long that he had forgotten what it was like to feel anything without fear. From my perspective, standing only a few feet away, I felt something shift inside me as I watched him soften, as I saw the ruthless man I had known for years slowly unravel into someone vulnerable, someone painfully human, someone who finally understood the cost of silencing his own heart. I had never seen him look this exposed, this desperate, this willing to be hurt again if it meant offering some piece of comfort to a child whose suffering mirrored his own. And for a moment I believed this connection, fragile and unexpected, might finally give him the peace he had been chasing through money and power his entire life. But just when the air seemed to settle, just when I thought the boy might accept the help he had been offered, just when the billionaire's entire world hovered on the edge of fragile hope, the boy lifted his gaze, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, and revealed something that made the billionaire's breath catch in his throat and sent a shock through me so sharp it felt like the room tilted beneath my feet. Because the boy didn't want what the billionaire was offering. When the child finally explained the meaning of those 5 words, the billionaire looked as if his heart stopped beating, and the silence that followed was so heavy, so absolute, that it felt as though the entire building had paused with him, waiting for something inside him to restart, waiting for the world to settle, after a truth that had shattered everything he believed he had buried for good. The boy took a slow breath, his small hands tightening at his sides as though summoning the courage to pierce open wounds that weren't even his. And when he lifted his eyes to meet the billionaire's trembling stare, his voice came out soft but steady, carrying a weight far beyond his years as he repeated the 5 words with a clarity that made my skin prickle. He told me to find you. At first, I didn't understand why those words shook the billionaire so violently. But then the boy explained that the he was referring to wasn't a neighbor or a teacher or some passing stranger offering comfort in a collapsing world, but someone who had been with him through every dark moment, someone who had protected him when life grew unbearable, someone who had whispered those 5 words on the last night he ever saw him. And as the boy spoke, I watched the billionaire's expression contort into something raw and unrecognizable, because he knew, long before the boy said the name, exactly who it was. The connection to the billionaire's past slammed into the room like a tidal wave, because the person the child was talking about was the same younger brother the billionaire had lost decades ago, the same boy who once clung to him during storms, the same boy whose disappearance had destroyed whatever softness remained inside him, the same boy who had whispered those exact 5 words in a trembling voice when fear filled their childhood home with shadows, and hearing them now, spoken by another child, at another time, in another life, made it impossible to believe that fate hadn't twisted the lines of their stories together for a reason neither of them had been ready to face. The emotional release that followed was not loud or explosive. It was devastating in its quietness, the billionaire's breath collapsing inward as though the truth had punched through the ribs he had spent years reinforcing, and he pressed a shaking hand against his forehead as if trying to hold back memories that were flooding through him faster than he could comprehend. Memories of promises he couldn't keep, guilt he never escaped, and grief he never allowed himself to mourn. Shock rippled through him in waves, each one deeper than the last. And when he finally managed to speak, his voice cracked as he asked the boy how he knew his brother, how the 5 words survived all these years, how they had found their way into the mouth of another child who shouldn't have had any connection to a past the billionaire had spent a lifetime locking away. And the boy swallowed hard before revealing the truth he had been carrying like a burden that didn't belong to him. The boy's true purpose for coming wasn't to ask for money or shelter or even help. He had come because his own caretaker, the only person who ever showed him love, had whispered those 5 words to him before disappearing from his life forever. And that caretaker had grown up hearing stories about a man he believed would one day make things right, a man he never stopped searching for, a man he hoped the boy would find when he no longer could. And with that truth, a hidden reality about the boy's identity emerges. He stood frozen, faced with a choice that threatened everything he built, and for a long, breathless moment, it seemed as though the world around him held still, unwilling to move until he did, as if even time understood the weight of what was unfolding in front of us, because this wasn't just a decision about responsibility or charity or remorse. This was a decision that reached into the very core of who he was, challenging the identity he had spent his entire adulthood forging out of pain, ambition, and relentless control. The billionaire was being forced to choose between his empire and the boy, between the life he had constructed like a fortress and the fragile connection that had reopened the deepest wound of his past. And I could see the battle raging inside him in the subtle tremors of his hands, the sharp rise and fall of his chest, the way his eyes darted toward the glass windows overlooking the city he ruled, then back to the boy whose presence threatened to dismantle everything he thought he had mastered about himself. His inner battle, pride versus redemption, played out in silence, but the intensity of it was so palpable that it felt like a storm gathering right in the center of the lobby, twisting the air into a charged and volatile tension, because on one side stood the pride that had driven him to become one of the most feared and respected men in the country, the pride that protected him from vulnerability, the pride that told him emotions were liabilities and attachments were traps. And on the other side stood the possibility of redemption he had never allowed himself to consider, the chance to finally confront the guilt he had carried like a silent anchor, the chance to break the cycle of pain that had defined both his own childhood and the boy's. I watched him struggle with a heaviness in my chest that made it difficult to breathe, because the man who once appeared unshakable now looked terrified, as if choosing the boy meant tearing apart the foundation he depended on for survival. Yet turning away from him meant repeating the mistake that had haunted him for decades. And I felt my own emotions twist painfully as I realized there was no easy path for him, no decision that would leave him untouched or unscarred. From where I stood, I could see the flicker of memories crossing his face, memories of a brother he failed to protect, memories of promises broken by circumstances he couldn't control, memories of nights when he was just a scared child trying to hold together a world that was collapsing around him. And it became painfully clear that this decision wasn't just about the boy in front of him. It was about the boy he used to be, the boy he abandoned inside himself long before he ever abandoned anyone else. The more he looked at the child, the more the walls around him began to shake, and although he said nothing, his silence spoke louder than any confession could have, revealing all the emotions he had spent a lifetime burying: the guilt, the longing, the grief, the desperation for a second chance he never thought he would be offered. I felt my own eyes sting as I watched his final decision slowly forming, not through words, but through the subtle collapse of resistance in his posture, the softening of his breath, the way his gaze lingered on the boy not with fear anymore, but with recognition, acceptance, and a painfully unfamiliar tenderness. And with each passing second I could sense that he was drifting further away from the man he had been and closer to the man he might become if he dared to choose differently this time. The tension in the room tightened as he took a single step forward, a step that seemed to echo through the entire space with a weight far greater than its sound, and everyone around us seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see whether he would sacrifice the empire he built or the redemption he desperately needed, waiting to see whether he would cling to the pride that had protected him or shatter it for the sake of a boy whose presence had already changed him more than he could admit. And when he finally chose, none of us were prepared for the consequences. In the end, those 5 words didn't break him. They rebuilt him, reshaping the man who had once believed he was beyond repair. And as I look back on the weeks that followed his decision, it still amazes me how quietly transformation can begin, not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but with small, hesitant choices made by a man who finally allowed himself to feel again after years of refusing to acknowledge he had a heart to protect in the first place. Their relationship transformed in ways none of us anticipated, because the billionaire who once terrified boardrooms with a single glance now sat beside the boy with a gentleness I didn't know he was capable of, guiding him through homework, listening to him speak about the fears he carried, showing him a steadiness that came not from power, but from genuine care. And I realized he wasn't trying to replace his brother, nor was he trying to rewrite the tragedy he had spent his life outrunning. He was trying to be the man he wished someone had been for him when he was the same age, scared, lost, and aching for someone to tell him he mattered. I watched him take steps that would have seemed impossible only months earlier, steps that required vulnerability instead of authority, patience instead of control, presence instead of avoidance, and each step dismantled another layer of the emotional armor he had worn for so long that removing it felt almost like shedding a second skin. He apologized more freely, listened more deeply, allowed silence to exist without tension, and let the boy's trust grow gradually instead of trying to force it through grand displays of wealth or power. And the change in him was so profound that even the people who once feared his temper began to see glimpses of the man he might have been if life hadn't carved its harsh lessons into him at such a young age. The billionaire's healing journey didn't conclude in a single moment or a single revelation. It unfolded slowly, quietly, like a long breath released after years of suffocation, and I could see it in the way his shoulders softened, in the way he no longer carried guilt like a shadow pressed permanently against him, in the way he allowed himself to remember his brother without collapsing into anger or grief, and in the way he finally spoke about the past, not as a curse, but as a truth he had survived. There were nights when I found him sitting with the boy, both of them wrapped in the kind of stillness that comes from finally feeling safe. And in those moments, I realized healing wasn't something he achieved. It was something he lived. The boy's life changed permanently as well, not because he was suddenly surrounded by wealth or luxury, but because he finally had stability, guidance, and a presence that didn't disappear when the world grew difficult. He laughed more often, slept more peacefully, and began to stand a little taller each day, as if the weight he had carried for so long was finally being lifted one memory at a time. He blossomed under the simple reassurance that someone would show up for him tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, and watching the light return to his eyes felt like witnessing a childhood being given back to someone who desperately needed it. As for me, my role changed in ways I never expected, because I had entered this story as an assistant following orders, managing schedules, maintaining distance. Yet I found myself drawn into their world as a witness to a transformation that reminded me of the humanity I sometimes forgot existed beneath the machinery of success. I became someone they both leaned on, a translator between their pasts, a quiet anchor in their present, a person who learned, through them, that healing often requires more than strength. It requires presence, patience, and the courage to stay even when the truth becomes difficult to bear. And in my reflective moments, watching their futures intertwine, I realized that those 5 words did more than reconnect 2 broken lives. They reshaped mine as well, forcing me to confront the parts of myself I had ignored, the wounds I had dismissed, the stories I hadn't allowed myself to finish. And in witnessing their healing, I found pieces of my own. Even now, those 5 words echo inside me, as if they were meant for my life, too. If this story pulled you into its world the way it pulled me, let me know which moment struck you the hardest, because your voice shapes the stories I tell, and every comment helps this community grow into something real.